I wanted to come on and it's been 2 weeks since.
She was not a celebrity. She was not a politician. She was not someone whose name filled headlines for years. But the story of Nancy Guthrie is one that, once you hear it, you simply cannot forget. Because this is not just a story about one woman. This is a story about faith, tested beyond what any human being should ever have to endure. It is a story about loss so devastating it would have destroyed most people. A story about secrets that took years to surface. About questions that hung in the air like smoke, long after the fire had burned out. And right now, in just the past few weeks, new information has come forward that is reshaping everything we thought. We knew about Nancy's journey and the choices she made in the darkest seasons of her life. What has been uncovered is not just surprising. It is heartbreaking. It is redemptive, and in some ways, deeply unsettling. Before we go any further, you need to understand who Nancy Guthrie really is, because the headlines never told the full story. What she has quietly carried for years goes far deeper than anything that was ever reported. So stay with us, because this story is about to go somewhere that will stay with you long after this video ends. There's a small town in Tennessee where mornings arrive slow and golden, where neighbors still wave from front porches, and the sound of church bells on Sunday is as familiar as birdsong. It was in this kind of place that Nancy Guthrie built her life. Not a glamorous life, not a perfect one, but a real one, filled with the kind of quiet love and stubborn hope that most people spend their whole lives searching for. Nancy grew up in a family that believed in hard work, in showing up, in not complaining even when the weight of the world pressed hard against your chest. She learned early that life was not always fair. She learned early that some prayers do not get answered the way you expect them to. And she learned over time that grief is not something you survive just once. Sometimes it comes back, again and again, wearing different faces, until you are forced to decide, once and for all, what you are truly made of. By all outward appearances, Nancy was the kind of woman you might overlook in a crowd, soft-spoken, warm, thoughtful, the kind of person who remembered your birthday, who brought food to your door when you were sick, who listened, really listened, without interrupting. Those who knew her described her the same way, almost every single time. She had this presence, they would say, this stillness, like she had already survived something most of us never will, and it had made her quieter, but not broken. The truth, it turns out, is that they were more right than they ever knew, because beneath that stillness, beneath that quiet grace, Nancy Guthrie was carrying a story the world had only ever seen fragments of. A story that began with joy and collapsed, more than once, into unimaginable sorrow. A story that forced her into a spotlight she never asked for, and then sent her retreating back into the shadows, trying to heal in private while the world moved on without her. What we are about to share is not meant to sensationalize her pain. It is meant to do something far more important than that. It is meant to bear witness, to sit with the full weight of what Nancy Guthrie has lived through, and to finally, carefully, examine the new details that have emerged and ask what they mean, not just for her story, but for all of us who have ever had to rebuild from something we never saw coming. To understand the new developments that have just come to light, you have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning, for Nancy Guthrie, is both beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Nancy met her husband David the way love often arrives, quietly, without announcement. In the middle of ordinary life, he was steady and kind, the kind of man who made a room feel safer just by walking into it. They built a life together with intention and with tenderness. They had a son named Matthew, who became the center of their world. By all accounts, the Guthrie household was not one of excess or spectacle. It was one of warmth, of laughter around the dinner table, of bedtime prayers and weekend hikes and the ordinary, beautiful texture of a family finding its rhythm. Then, in 1998, their daughter Hope was born, and with her arrival came the kind of news that no parent should ever have to receive. Hope was diagnosed with Zellweger syndrome, a rare and fatal metabolic disorder that attacks the nervous system and leaves doctors with almost nothing to offer except comfort care. The prognosis was devastating. Hope would not survive. She would live, if she lived at all, only for a matter of months. And yet Nancy and David made a choice that would define everything that followed. They chose to love her, fully, completely, without reservation or self-protection. They chose to be present with hope in every single moment they were given, knowing that every one of those moments had an expiration date they could not change. Hope lived for 6 months, and when she died, something inside the Guthrie family shifted in ways that would take years to fully understand. Grief after the loss of a child is unlike any other kind of grief. Those who have lived it describe it as a presence that never fully leaves, a shadow that walks beside you even on your brightest days. For Nancy, the loss of hope was not the end of her grief. It was the beginning of a season of it so prolonged, so layered, that even she has struggled to put it fully into words. What most people did not know at the time, what has only now begun to surface in more complete detail, is what was really happening beneath the surface of the Guthrie household during those months of mourning. The questions Nancy was wrestling with in the dark, the doubts, the anger she had to learn how to hold without being consumed by it. There were conversations happening behind closed doors that were never public, never performative, never polished for an audience. There was raw, unfiltered pain that never made it into interviews, into books, into public appearances. And then, as if the universe had not already asked enough of them, Nancy became pregnant again. The pregnancy arrived wrapped in a complicated mixture of fear and fragile hope. When their son Gabriel was born and received the same diagnosis as Hope, the world seemed to stop entirely. Another child, another fatal diagnosis, another goodbye already being written before they had even fully said hello. Many people on the outside marveled at the Guthries' composure, their faith, their apparent grace. But what the new information now suggests is this: the story the public saw was only a portion of the story that was actually being lived. For years, Nancy Guthrie has been open about her faith and her grief in ways that have helped thousands of people navigate their own seasons of loss. Her books, her speaking engagements, her podcast, all of it formed a body of work that was genuine, hard-won, and deeply personal. But even within that openness, there were rooms she kept closed, parts of the story she held back, not out of deception, but out of the kind of self-preservation that anyone who has survived profound loss will recognize immediately. What is now emerging, through recent interviews, newly released recordings, and accounts from people close to Nancy, is a more complete picture of just how close she came to losing not just her children, but herself. There were periods, long stretches of time, when Nancy was not the composed and faith-filled woman the world saw standing on a stage. There were seasons when she sat in the dark and could not find her way back to the light, when the theology she had built her life on felt hollow and distant, like a language she had once spoken fluently, but had suddenly, terrifyingly, forgotten. She has spoken about grief, but what is now coming out is the depth of her crisis of identity, the long and painful process of figuring out who she was, when everything she had attached her sense of self to had been stripped completely away. The loss of Hope, the loss of Gabriel, the renegotiation of her marriage under the crushing weight of compounded grief. These were not just personal tragedies. They were earthquakes, ones that rattled the very foundation of her sense of self, her purpose, and her place in the world. One of the most striking new revelations concerns the period immediately following Gabriel's death. Those close to Nancy describe a woman who was outwardly functional, but inwardly in freefall. She continued to show up. She continued to care for her son Matthew. She continued to tend to her marriage and her home. But inside, there was a reckoning happening that no one had a full view of. A profound and painful questioning that went far deeper than anything she had ever shared publicly. David Guthrie, in a recent conversation that has since circulated widely, described the weight of that time with a candor that surprised even those who thought they knew the full story. He spoke about the nights that had no end, the conversations that circled the same impossible questions without resolution, the fear that grief had grown into something bigger than either of them had the tools to manage alone. What is significant here is not that Nancy struggled. What is significant is the gap, the distance between what she was actually living and what the world believed she was living. Because that gap, that chasm between the polished public narrative and the unpolished private reality, is exactly where the most important truth of her story lives. And it is only now, years later, that the full dimensions of that gap are becoming clear to those who have followed her story. From the very beginning, the emerging picture is not one of a woman who had it all figured out. It is the picture of a woman who was fractured and afraid, quietly, stubbornly fighting her way back, one day at a time, with no guarantee that she would make it. Here's where the story takes a turn that many did not see coming. Because against all odds, against every statistical and emotional probability, Nancy Guthrie did not disappear into her grief. She did not go silent. She did not close herself off from the world and allow her losses to calcify into permanent bitterness. Instead, she began to write, not for an audience at first, not for publication or platform or purpose. She wrote because it was the only way she knew how to externalize the internal storm, the only tool available to her when every other form of expression felt entirely inadequate. Those early writings, raw and unfiltered and never meant for public eyes, have become the subject of significant attention in recent weeks, as those who knew her speak more candidly about what that period actually looked like. What they describe is a woman at a desk in the early morning hours, before the rest of the house woke up, pouring herself onto the page with a kind of desperate urgency, not writing toward an answer, writing simply toward the act of surviving another day. Slowly, painstakingly, something began to shift. The writing began to take shape. The fragments began to cohere, and what had started as a private act of survival began to look, tentatively, like something that could be shared with others who were drowning in their own grief and desperately searching for proof that drowning did not have to be the end. Her first book emerged from that process, and the response, when it came, was unlike anything she had been prepared for. Letters arrived by the hundreds, emails, phone, calls from strangers who said her words had reached them at the exact moment they needed to be reached. The scale of the response to Nancy's work created a new kind of pressure, one she has only recently begun to speak about with full honesty. Because when thousands of people look to you as a guide through grief, when your name becomes synonymous with survival and faith and resilience, an invisible weight settles on your shoulders that never fully lifts. You become responsible, in some perceived sense, for the hope of people you have never even met. And that responsibility, however unasked for, shapes you in ways both beautiful and deeply complicated. What is now being understood more clearly is the toll that this carried. The years of public ministry built directly on the foundation of her most private wounds. The ongoing demand to be present, available, and wise, even on the days when she felt none of those things. The way the public narrative of her strength sometimes outpaced the private reality of her ongoing struggle. Sources close to Nancy describe a woman who was generous to a fault, who gave of herself without adequate account of what remained, who said yes far more than was sustainable, because saying no felt like a betrayal of the very people who needed her most. This pattern, quietly and gradually, began to exact a cost, not a visible cost, not the kind that makes headlines or triggers public concern, but the slow, corrosive kind, the kind that accumulates in the body and the spirit until one day, without warning, something gives. What gave and how Nancy responded when it did is at the very heart of the new developments that are only now becoming fully visible to those paying close attention. The recent revelations about Nancy Guthrie center on a period of withdrawal that many of her followers noticed, but few truly understood. There was a stretch of time, longer than most realized, during which Nancy stepped back significantly from public life. Appearances became fewer. Her online presence dimmed. Those who reached out received warm but brief responses. The explanations offered were general, the familiar language of rest and renewal that is easy to accept at face value. But the truth, as is so often the case, was more complicated and far more human than any polished explanation could capture. Nancy was not simply resting. She was in the middle of the most significant personal reckoning of her adult life. Not a crisis of faith in the way that phrase is so often carelessly deployed, but something more nuanced, more difficult to name. A deep and necessary confrontation with the stories she had been telling about herself, the roles she had accepted, The way she had quietly defined her own worth in relation to her productivity, her usefulness, her capacity to hold others together. The conversations she was having during this period, now being shared carefully, and with her knowledge, reveal a woman doing the slow and deeply unglamorous work of dismantling and rebuilding from the inside out. She was re-examining the foundations. She was asking which parts of her public identity were truly authentic, and which had been constructed, however unconsciously, as armor against further pain. She was learning, at significant personal cost, the vital difference between helping from a place of wholeness and helping from a place of wounds. What makes the new development so significant is not just what Nancy went through during this period. It is what she found waiting on the other side of it. Because after years of quietly doing this interior work, after the long and often invisible labor of rebuilding herself on entirely different terms, something unexpected emerged. A new quality to her voice, a deeper, less performative kind of honesty, a willingness to say I do not have the answer that felt, paradoxically, more trustworthy than any answer she had ever offered before. Those who have spoken with her recently describe a woman who seems, for perhaps the first time in a long while, genuinely at ease in her own skin. Not because the pain is gone, not because the losses have receded or the questions have finally been answered, but because she has stopped requiring those things in order to simply be okay. She has reached, by a long and winding and often agonizing road, a kind of peace that is not the absence of grief, but the presence of something large enough to hold it. The new work she is preparing, details of which have begun to quietly circulate, reflects this transformation in ways that those who have followed her for years describe as unlike anything she has ever produced before. More vulnerable, more willing to sit inside uncertainty, more insistent that the full, unedited human experience deserves to be honored. Not just the parts that resolve neatly and confirm what we already hoped was true. Nancy Guthrie, it turns out, had one more chapter no one saw coming. And if what those closest to her are saying is accurate, it may be the most important one yet.